Picture this. It's just before midnight on Thursday, March the 2nd, 1961. A cold, late winter wind is whipping down Eagle Street in Albany, New York. The city is quiet. Inside the historic 40-room executive mansion, the governor of New York, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and his wife, Mary Todd Hunter Clark Rockefeller, are asleep in their separate second-floor bedrooms. Down the hall, 3 of their staff are also settling in for the night. The house is still. The lights are out. It's a scene of perfect, powerful tranquility. But calling this just a house is like calling a lion a kitten. This is the New York State Executive Mansion, a sprawling 3-story Victorian fortress that has been the home of governors since 1875. We're talking about a building that has housed 3 future presidents of the United States: Grover Cleveland, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's a living museum, a symbol of power, a repository of priceless art and American history. And in the dead of night, it is about to become a raging inferno. Suddenly, a flicker. A wisp of smoke curls from a ground-floor sitting room where a pile of furniture, polish-soaked rags left behind by a maintenance crew, has just spontaneously combusted. It's a tiny, innocent-looking spark, but in a house filled with 105 years of dry timber, antique furniture, and flammable varnish, it's a death sentence. The fire begins to smolder, then to crawl, silently at first, up the mansion's walls. Now, let's talk numbers. 40 rooms. Let that sink in for a moment. The average American home today has about 5. This mansion had 8 times that. It had a grand ballroom, a formal dining room that could seat dozens, a private zoo installed by a previous governor, Al Smith, and even a swimming pool put in by FDR. The mansion wasn't just a home. It was a self-contained world. And the art. Oh, the art. Nelson Rockefeller, a man whose name is synonymous with one of the world's greatest art collections, had filled the mansion with his personal treasures. We're talking about paintings valued at over $350,000 in 1961 dollars. That's the equivalent of over $3.5 million today. These weren't just decorations, they were masterpieces from the Museum of Modern Art and his own private collection, lent to the state to bring a touch of modern brilliance to the historic home. And it's all about to go up in smoke. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. The fire, as devastating as it was, wasn't the real threat to the mansion. The real threat came after the flames were put out. The real threat came from the very government that was supposed to protect it. But why? Why would anyone, let alone the government of New York, want to destroy this priceless piece of American history? How did a building that survived a catastrophic fire then face an even greater enemy in a committee of bureaucrats? And most intriguingly, how did one of the richest, most powerful men in America, a Rockefeller, find himself in a desperate fight to save his own home from the government he was elected to lead? To answer those questions, we need to understand the man at the center of the storm: Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller, the governor. To understand why Nelson Rockefeller would go to war for a pile of charred bricks and smoldering timber, you have to understand that he was a different kind of Rockefeller. While his grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr., was a titan of industry who built the Standard Oil empire through ruthless efficiency, and his father, John D. Jr., was a reserved philanthropist who dedicated his life to giving away the family fortune, Nelson was something else entirely. He was a politician, and not just any politician. He was a force of nature. Born in 1908, Nelson was the third of 6 children. He grew up in a world of unimaginable wealth, shuttling between the family's 9-story mansion in Manhattan, the sprawling 3-acre estate of Kykuit in the Hudson Valley, and various other palatial homes. But his father was determined that his children would not be spoiled by their privilege. They were given meager allowances, required to do chores, and taught that their wealth was a sacred trust to be used for the public good. While his brothers went into finance and philanthropy, Nelson was drawn to the world of public service. He had a charisma, an energy, a sheer force of will that was undeniable. He was handsome, charming, and had a smile that could disarm his fiercest opponents. But beneath that affable exterior was a core of pure, unadulterated ambition. Nelson Rockefeller wanted to be President of the United States, and he saw the governorship of New York as his stepping stone to the White House. He was elected governor in 1958, and he arrived in Albany like a whirlwind. He was a Republican, but a liberal one, a champion of civil rights, environmental protection, and massive public works projects. He was a builder, a modernizer, a man who saw a problem and immediately wanted to pour concrete on it. He envisioned a New York that was bigger, bolder, and more modern than ever before, and he was willing to spend whatever it took to make that vision a reality. But when he moved into the executive mansion in 1959, he was appalled. The historic home, which had been occupied by a succession of governors with more modest tastes and budgets, had fallen into a state of genteel decay. The furniture was worn, the carpets were threadbare, and the decor was a hodgepodge of mismatched styles. To a man of Rockefeller's aesthetic sensibilities, it was an affront. This wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of the state of New York, and he was determined to make it a symbol of modern, progressive, and powerful government. So he did what Rockefellers do. He threw money at the problem. He and his wife, Todd, embarked on a massive renovation project, bringing in their own furniture, their own art, and their own team of designers. They transformed the dark Victorian mansion into a showcase of modern art and design. They hung works by Picasso, Rothko, and de Kooning on the walls. They replaced the tired, old furniture with sleek, modern pieces. They turned the governor's residence into a living, breathing extension of their own sophisticated tastes. But not everyone was impressed. To some, Rockefeller's renovations were a betrayal of the mansion's historic character. They saw it as an act of arrogance, a rich man imposing his personal taste on a public landmark. They grumbled that the governor was turning the people's house into his own private palace, and they weren't entirely wrong. Nelson Rockefeller had a vision, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like tradition stand in his way. And then came the fire. In the middle of the night, on March 2, 1961, that vision went up in flames. The fire, which started in a pile of oily rags, quickly spread through the mansion's old, dry timbers. The first floor was gutted. The grand staircase was destroyed. The priceless art was turned to ash. And the governor and his wife were forced to flee for their lives, climbing down a ladder in their nightclothes as the flames licked at their bedroom windows. In the aftermath of the fire, the full extent of the damage became clear. The mansion was a wreck. The first floor was a blackened, waterlogged mess. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and the art, the beautiful modern art that Rockefeller had so proudly installed, was gone. A Picasso, a Rothko, a de Kooning, all destroyed. The total value of the lost art was estimated at over $350,000, a staggering sum in 1961. But the loss was more than just financial. It was personal. It was a blow to Rockefeller's pride, to his vision, to his very identity. He had come to Albany to build, to create, to modernize. And now his own home, the symbol of his governorship, was a smoldering ruin. It was a personal and political disaster. And then, the other shoe dropped. In the days following the fire, a new threat emerged, a threat not from fire, but from his own government. A chorus of voices began to rise, arguing that the mansion was too old, too damaged, too expensive to repair. They said it was a fire trap, a relic of a bygone era. They said it was time to tear it down and build a new, modern governor's mansion, somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere better. To many, it seemed like a sensible idea. The mansion was, after all, a 105-year-old wooden building. It had been a fire waiting to happen. And now that the fire had happened, why not take the opportunity to start fresh? Why not build a new, modern mansion that would be a fitting home for a modern, progressive governor like Nelson Rockefeller? But to Rockefeller, the idea was unthinkable. Tear down the executive mansion, the home of 3 presidents, the symbol of New York's history and power? It was sacrilege. It was a betrayal of everything he believed in. He was a builder, yes, but he was also a preservationist. He believed in progress, but he also believed in history. And he was not about to let a committee of bureaucrats tear down a priceless piece of American history on his watch. And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side were the pragmatists, the modernizers, the bureaucrats who saw the mansion as a liability. On the other side was Nelson Rockefeller, the patrician governor, the art lover, the history buff, who saw the mansion as a sacred trust. It was a battle for the soul of the executive mansion, a battle between the past and the future, a battle between preservation and progress. And it was a battle that Nelson Rockefeller was determined to win. He started by doing what he did best. He used his power and influence. He made it clear to his staff, to the legislature, to anyone who would listen, that he would not stand for the demolition of the mansion. He argued that the mansion was more than just a building. It was a symbol. It was a symbol of New York's history, its resilience, its enduring strength, and he was not about to let that symbol be reduced to a pile of rubble. He also used his considerable knowledge of art and architecture to make his case. He argued that the mansion, despite its age, was a masterpiece of Victorian design. He pointed out that it had been designed by some of the most prominent architects of its day. And he argued that it was a priceless example of a style of architecture that was rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. But his most powerful weapon was his own personal commitment. He announced that he would personally contribute to the cost of the restoration. He said he would pay for the replacement of the lost art. He made it clear that he was not just fighting for a building, he was fighting for his home. And he was willing to put his own money where his mouth was. It was a masterful performance. Rockefeller's passion, his eloquence, and his sheer force of will were impossible to ignore. He rallied public opinion to his side. He won over the skeptics. And in the end, he got his way. The plan to demolish the mansion was abandoned. The government agreed to fund a full restoration. And Nelson Rockefeller, the man who had come to Albany to build the future, had saved a priceless piece of the past. But the story doesn't end there. Because the restoration of the executive mansion was just the beginning. It was the first battle in a long and bitter war, a war that would pit Nelson Rockefeller against the forces of progress, the demands of the modern world, and the very government he was elected to lead. It was a war that would define his legacy and shape the future of New York for decades to come. And it all started with a fire in the middle of the night. So, the mansion was saved from the wrecking ball. A victory for preservation, a victory for Nelson Rockefeller. But now came the hard part, the real challenge. It's one thing to stop a demolition, it's another thing entirely to rebuild a ruin. And make no mistake, the executive mansion was a ruin. Imagine you're on the inspection team in the days after the fire. You step through the front doors, and the smell of wet, charred wood hits you like a physical blow. The grand foyer, once a welcoming space of polished wood and gleaming brass, is now a cavern of black. The magnificent grand staircase, the heart of the mansion, is gone. Just a gaping, smoky hole leading up to the second floor. The first floor rooms, the library, the drawing room, the sitting room where the fire started, are gutted. Ceilings have collapsed, walls are scorched black, and everything is covered in a thick layer of soot and drenched from the thousands of gallons of water used to fight the fire. This wasn't a simple repair job. This was a resurrection. The state government had approved the restoration, but they had no idea what they were up against. The initial damage estimate was pegged at around $450,000, a huge sum. But as the architects and engineers began to peel back the layers of damage, they realized the true cost would be far, far higher. This is where the sheer force of Nelson Rockefeller's will came into play. This was no longer just a government project, it was his personal mission. He assembled a team of the finest architects, engineers, and historians in the country. He pored over blueprints. He debated the merits of different types of wood varnish. He was involved in every single decision, from the color of the paint to the design of the doorknobs. But here was the central conflict, the question that defined the entire project. Do you restore the mansion to exactly what it was before the fire? Or do you take the opportunity to improve it, to modernize it, to make it safer and more functional? For Rockefeller, the answer was both. He demanded absolute historical accuracy in the public-facing rooms. The woodwork, the plaster, the paint, it all had to be perfect, a flawless recreation of the 19th century original. But behind the walls, he wanted the best of the 20th century. Modern wiring, a state-of-the-art heating system, and most importantly, a fire suppression system that would ensure this kind of disaster could never happen again. And he wanted it done fast. Unbelievably fast. Rockefeller wasn't content to live in temporary housing for years while the mansion was slowly rebuilt. He gave his team an impossible deadline. He wanted the entire project finished, from top to bottom, in 9 months. 9 months. Let that sink in. To rebuild a 40-room historic mansion from a smoldering ruin in less time than it takes to have a baby. It was an absurd, audacious, and quintessentially Rockefeller-esque demand. The project became a round-the-clock operation. A small army of craftsmen descended on Albany. Italian stonemasons, brought in to repair the marble fireplaces. English woodworkers, tasked with the near-impossible job of recreating the grand staircase. French artisans, specialists in decorative plaster, painstakingly molding new ceiling medallions to replace the ones that had been destroyed. Think about the staircase for a moment. The original was built from hand-carved, old-growth mahogany. You couldn't just go to a lumberyard and buy that in 1961. Rockefeller's team had to source the wood from specialty dealers, finding timber that matched the age, the grain, and the color of the original. Then, the woodworkers had to recreate the intricate carvings, the sweeping banisters, the elegant newel posts, all from just a few surviving photographs and architectural drawings. It was an act of historical detective work and breathtaking craftsmanship. And while this historic recreation was happening on the surface, a technological revolution was happening underneath. This was the hidden genius of the project. The mansion looked medieval on the outside, but it was becoming absolutely cutting-edge on the inside. Hundreds of feet of old, dangerous knob and tube wiring were ripped out and replaced with a modern, safe electrical system. A new, efficient boiler was installed, and, most critically, a network of sprinklers and smoke detectors was subtly integrated into the historic ceilings, a hidden shield to protect the mansion from its own fiery past. This was a logistical nightmare. How do you run modern ductwork through 19th century walls without destroying the historic fabric? How do you install sprinkler heads in ornate plaster ceilings without them looking like an ugly modern intrusion? It required a level of ingenuity and collaboration that was unprecedented. The architects and engineers were essentially performing surgery on the building, carefully inserting the organs of the 20th century into the body of the 19th. Then there was the art. The empty, scorched walls were a constant, painful reminder of what had been lost. For Rockefeller, this was unacceptable. A home without art was just a collection of rooms. He took it upon himself to recurate the entire mansion. He worked with the Museum of Modern Art, of which he was president, to select new pieces. He brought in works from his own unparalleled personal collection. He didn't just want to replace the art that was lost. He wanted to create a collection that was even better, even more daring, even more representative of his vision. As the months flew by, the mansion slowly came back to life. The smell of smoke was replaced by the smell of fresh paint and sawdust. The blackened timbers were covered with new plaster and gleaming woodwork. The empty spaces on the walls were filled with vibrant, challenging modern art. A new phoenix was rising from the ashes, a building that was both a faithful restoration and a bold statement of modernity. It was the perfect embodiment of its patron, a man deeply rooted in history, but with his eyes fixed firmly on the future. Of course, a project of this scale and speed was bound to go over budget. The final cost of the restoration ballooned from the initial estimate of $450,000 to $588,000. That's over $5.8 million in today's money. The state comptroller balked, the legislature grumbled. But Rockefeller, ever the master politician, had a solution. He simply announced that he would pay the difference himself. He wrote a personal check for $58,000 to cover the cost overruns. It was a brilliant move. It silenced his critics, demonstrated his personal commitment, and reinforced his image as a man who got things done, no matter the cost. Finally, in December 1961, just 9 months after the fire, the work was complete. The New York State Executive Mansion, which had been a smoldering ruin in March, was once again a magnificent, gleaming palace. On December 17th, Governor Rockefeller and his wife hosted a grand reopening, leading tours of the refurbished residence. The press was stunned. The public was impressed. It was a triumph. He had faced down the bureaucrats who wanted to tear it down. He had managed an impossible construction timeline. He had blended historic preservation with modern innovation. He had, through sheer force of will, brought the mansion back from the dead. It was a testament to his vision, his power, and his unshakable belief in the importance of symbols. But the restoration of the mansion did something else. It awakened a new, even grander ambition in Nelson Rockefeller. He had seen how he could transform a single building, how he could bend the machinery of government to his will, how he could impose his vision on the physical landscape. And now he began to look beyond the gates of the executive mansion. He began to look at the city of Albany itself. While others saw a sleepy provincial state capital, Rockefeller saw a blank canvas. He saw a city that was unworthy of the great state of New York. He saw a city that was ripe for transformation. The battle for the mansion was over. But the war for the soul of Albany was just beginning, and that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. To live in the newly restored executive mansion was to live in a bubble of perfection. It was a world of polished mahogany, priceless art, and impeccable taste. It was a world that Nelson Rockefeller had personally willed into existence. But every time he left that bubble, every time he drove through the gates and into the streets of Albany, he was confronted with a jarring reality. Albany in the early 1960s was not a city that reflected the ambition and power of the Empire State. It was a tired, old river town. The area surrounding the state capitol and the executive mansion was a dense, working-class neighborhood of brick row houses, taverns, small shops, and warehouses. It was known as the Gut. It was a place with a long history, a tight-knit community, and a reputation for being a little rough around the edges. To Governor Rockefeller, it was an eyesore, an embarrassment, a personal affront. And then came the moment that changed everything. The story goes that in 1961, not long after the mansion was restored, Rockefeller was hosting Princess Juliana of the Netherlands. As they drove through the city, he was mortified by the view from her limousine window, the decaying buildings, the seedy bars, the general air of neglect. He reportedly turned to his aides and said, "This is a disgrace. We have to do something about this." Doing something, for Nelson Rockefeller, did not mean a coat of paint and a few new parks. It meant obliteration. It meant starting over. He envisioned a new Albany, a futuristic capital for a modern state. He saw a vast, gleaming complex of marble towers reflecting pools and monumental sculptures. A place that would rival the great capitals of the world. He called it the Empire State Plaza. But here's the hidden truth, the part of the story that gets lost in the shadow of those gleaming towers. To build his futuristic vision, Rockefeller had to first destroy the past. And the past was 98 acres of downtown Albany. Let that sink in. Not one or two buildings, 98 acres. That's the equivalent of 74 football fields. It was one of the largest urban renewal projects in American history. Imagine you're a resident of the Gut in 1962. You live in a brick row house that your family has owned for 3 generations. You walk your kids to the neighborhood school. You buy your groceries at the corner store. You know your neighbors by name. Your life is here. Your community is here. And then one day, you get a letter in the mail. It's from the state of New York, and it says your home, your neighborhood, your entire world is going to be demolished. Over 7,000 people were displaced by the construction of the Empire State Plaza. 7,000. That's more people than live in many small towns. And it wasn't just residents. Over 400 businesses were forced to close or relocate. Family-owned shops, restaurants, barbershops, factories. The entire economic fabric of the neighborhood was ripped apart. This wasn't just demolition. This was an eviction on a scale that was almost unimaginable. This is where our story takes a sharp, ironic turn. The same man who had just fought so passionately to save one historic building from the government was now using the full power of that same government to destroy an entire historic neighborhood. The preservationist had become the destroyer, and the weapon he used was the most powerful and controversial tool in the government's arsenal: eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of the government to seize private property for public use as long as they provide just compensation. It's a power that is supposed to be used for things like building roads, schools, or hospitals. But Rockefeller was using it to build his marble city. He was using it to wipe a neighborhood off the map. And the people of the gut were about to find out that you can't fight City Hall, especially when City Hall is backed by a Rockefeller. But there was one man who dared to try. The second protagonist in our story. While other politicians in his position were focused on local parades and ribbon cuttings, Erastus Corning II, the mayor of Albany, was a political institution. He was the head of the most powerful democratic machine in the state. He had been mayor since 1942, and he would remain mayor until his death in 1983, making him the longest-serving mayor of a major American city in history. He was old school, pragmatic, and deeply connected to the working-class people who lived in the gut. And he saw Rockefeller's Grand Plaza as a direct assault on his city and his power base. This set the stage for an epic political clash. On one side, you had Nelson Rockefeller, the billionaire Republican governor, the symbol of modern top-down, big government liberalism. On the other, you had Erastus Corning, the patrician Democratic mayor, the master of old-school, grassroots, machine politics. It was a battle of titans, a clash of two completely different worlds, and the battlefield was the 98 acres of the gut. Corning fought back. He used his political machine to organize protests. He filed lawsuits. He gave fiery speeches denouncing the project as a land grab, a boondoggle, a vanity project for a governor with presidential ambitions. He argued that the state had no right to destroy a neighborhood just to build a collection of office buildings. He was fighting for the soul of his city, for the little guy, for the idea that a community was more than just a collection of buildings that could be bulldozed at will. But he was outmatched. Rockefeller had the power of the state, the backing of the legislature, and most importantly, the money. He had a blank check. The initial cost estimate for the plaza was $250 million. By the time it was finished, the price tag had ballooned to an almost unbelievable $2 billion. That's billion with a B. In the 1970s, it was, at the time, the most expensive government building complex ever constructed in the United States. Rockefeller used a clever and legally dubious financing scheme to bypass the need for voter approval. The state didn't technically build the plaza. Instead, Albany County issued the bonds to pay for it, and the state signed a long-term lease, using the lease payments to pay off the bonds. It was a backdoor deal that allowed Rockefeller to build his dream without having to ask the taxpayers for permission. Mayor Corning and Albany County were essentially forced into the deal. They had been outmaneuvered, and so the demolition began. It was a slow, brutal process that unfolded over several years. Imagine the scene. Block by block, the neighborhood disappeared. The wrecking ball swung, the bulldozers roared. The brick row houses, the corner stores, the churches, the schools, they all came down. For the people who lived there, it was a slow-motion funeral. For their community, they watched as their homes were turned into rubble, their memories erased, their world dismantled. And what about that just compensation? The state offered homeowners buyouts, but they were often far below the true market value. And for many, the money couldn't replace what they had lost. They had lost their homes, their neighbors, their sense of place. They were scattered to the winds, forced to find new homes in unfamiliar neighborhoods, their community shattered forever. It was a human tragedy on a massive scale, all in the name of progress. As the old neighborhood vanished, the new one began to rise. And it was a sight to behold. The scale of the construction was staggering. A massive 6-story platform was built over the demolished neighborhood, creating a vast artificial landscape. On top of this platform, a collection of stark modernist towers began to climb towards the sky. The centerpiece was the Erastus Corning Tower, a 44-story skyscraper that would become the tallest building in New York State outside of New York City. Ironically, it was named after the very man who had fought so hard to stop the project. There was the Egg, a bizarre, otherworldly performing arts center that looked like a giant concrete sculpture. There was the Cultural Education Center, a massive, sweeping building that would house the State Museum and Library. And there were 4 identical 23-story agency office buildings marching in a rigid uniform line. It was all connected by a vast windswept plaza of marble and concrete, dotted with reflecting pools and abstract sculptures. This was Rockefeller's vision made real. It was monumental. It was imposing. It was sterile. It was the absolute antithesis of the messy, vibrant, human-scaled neighborhood it had replaced. It was a statement of power, a declaration that the state and its governor were in control. It was beautiful and terrible, all at the same time. And what was it like to work in this new reality? For the thousands of state workers who were moved into the new office towers, it was a shock. They went from working in cramped, old-fashioned offices scattered around the city to working in a futuristic, self-contained world. They could walk from their parking garage to their office to the cafeteria without ever setting foot outside. It was efficient, it was clean, and it was completely disconnected from the city around it. The plaza was an island, a fortress of government, floating above the city of Albany on a sea of marble. Rockefeller had gotten his wish. He had transformed the capital of the Empire State. He had created a monument to his own ambition, a legacy written in marble and steel. But in doing so, he had also destroyed a community, displaced thousands of people, and created a deep and lasting wound in the heart of the city. The man who had saved one building by fighting the government had used that same government to destroy 1,000 more. This is the great central contradiction of Nelson Rockefeller. He was a man who loved art and history, but who was willing to bulldoze a historic neighborhood to create his own version of beauty. He was a champion of the people, but who was willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of ordinary people for his grand vision. He was a builder and a destroyer, a preservationist and a modernist, a hero and a villain. As the Empire State Plaza neared completion in the late 1970s, it stood as a symbol of his immense power and his complex legacy. He had changed the face of Albany forever. But the story wasn't over. The plaza would soon face its own crisis, a crisis that threatened to turn Rockefeller's dream into a nightmare. And once again, the government would find itself at the center of a battle over the fate of one of its most iconic and controversial creations. For a time, it seemed like the story was over. Nelson Rockefeller had his monument. The Empire State Plaza was complete, a gleaming white city on a hill, a testament to the power of government to reshape the world. It was officially dedicated in 1973, and by the late 70s, it was a fully functioning, if controversial, part of Albany. The battle was won. The past was erased. The future was here. But empires have a way of crumbling, and sometimes they crumble from the outside in. The crisis, when it came, didn't start with a political scandal or a budget shortfall. It started with a sound, a sharp, cracking noise echoing across the vast, empty plaza on a cold winter's day. And then, a crash. A maintenance worker making his rounds saw it happen. A piece of white marble, the size of a dinner plate, had broken free from the facade of one of the agency towers, dozens of stories up, and shattered on the concrete below. It was a small event. No one was hurt. It was dismissed as a fluke, a minor imperfection in a massive project. But it was a warning, the first crack in the marble facade of Rockefeller's dream. Then it happened again, and again. More pieces of marble began to fall, small at first, then larger. The state, now under Governor Hugh Carey, was forced to act. They brought in engineers to inspect the buildings, and what they found was a nightmare. A catastrophic design flaw that threatened the entire complex. The plaza's 4 agency towers, the Cultural Education Center, and the Egg were all clad in brilliant white Georgian marble. Over 28,000 individual panels, each weighing several hundred pounds, were attached to the steel superstructure of the buildings. The engineers discovered that the anchoring system used to hold these massive panels in place was failing. The marble itself was too soft, and the extreme temperature swings of Albany's climate, from hot, humid summers to brutally cold, icy winters, were causing the panels to bow and warp. The steel anchors were corroding. The marble was, quite literally, tearing itself apart. Let that sink in. Every single one of the 28,000 marble panels was a potential time bomb. Each one was a several hundred-pound guillotine hanging over the heads of the thousands of people who worked at and visited the plaza every day. The gleaming white city was a death trap. The stakes had been raised dramatically and terrifyingly. Suddenly, the government that had built the plaza was faced with an impossible crisis. What do? Do you close the entire complex, displacing thousands of state workers and shutting down the core of state government? Do you build protective scaffolding over every inch of the 98-acre site, turning the futuristic plaza into a permanent construction zone? Or do you pray that no one gets killed? This created genuine, terrifying uncertainty. For years, the state tried to manage the problem. They sent out crews and cherry pickers to inspect every panel, tapping them with hammers to listen for hollow sounds that indicated a potential failure. They installed nets and wooden canopies over the entrances to the buildings to protect pedestrians. The monument to government efficiency and power had become a symbol of government failure, wrapped in safety nets like a patient in intensive care. And the irony was almost too perfect. The government, which had so ruthlessly destroyed a historic neighborhood to build this monument, was now faced with the prospect of having to dismantle its own creation. The cost of replacing every single one of the 28,000 marble panels was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a price tag that the state, now struggling with the economic crises of the 1970s and 80s, simply could not afford. And what of our two protagonists? Nelson Rockefeller, the man whose vision had created this crisis, was gone. He had resigned as governor in 1973 to serve as vice president under Gerald Ford. He died in 1979, before the full extent of the marble problem became a public crisis. He never had to face the consequences of his grand design's fatal flaw. But Mayor Erastus Corning was still there. Still the mayor of Albany. He had watched the plaza rise, had seen his city hollowed out, had warned of the project's hubris. And now, he watched as the marble began to fall. He didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. But in the crumbling facade of the Empire State Plaza, he saw a grim vindication. He had known, with the deep instinctual wisdom of a man who understood his city, that you cannot build a future by simply erasing the past. He knew that some things, once broken, can never be truly fixed. The crisis dragged on for years. Lawsuits were filed, blame was assigned. The original architect, Wallace Harrison, was sued. The construction companies were sued. The marble supplier was sued. It was a legal and financial quagmire, a perfect storm of government bureaucracy, corporate liability, and political finger-pointing. For the people of Albany, it was a constant, unnerving reminder of the project that had so brutally reshaped their city. The falling marble became a dark joke, a symbol of the plaza's arrogance and disconnect from reality. The grand, monumental plaza, which was supposed to be a public space for the people, was now a place to be avoided, a place where you had to watch your head. The government was trapped. They had created a monster, a beautiful, expensive, and dangerous monster. And now, they had to figure out how to tame it. The debate raged for years. Do we repair it? Do we replace the marble with something cheaper, like granite or precast concrete? Do we tear it all off and give the towers a completely new look? Each option was fantastically expensive and fraught with political peril. This was the ultimate crisis of Rockefeller's vision. He had wanted to build something permanent, something that would last for centuries, a monument to rival the great works of the Roman emperors. And instead, he had built something that began to decay within his own lifetime. He had used the full power of the American government to create a symbol of strength and modernity, and that same government was now faced with the humiliating task of patching it up, of containing its failures, of trying to stop it from destroying itself. The story of the Rockefeller Mansion fire was about a man fighting the government to save a building. The story of the Empire State Plaza was about a man using the government to destroy a neighborhood, and now the story had come full circle. The government was now in a fight with itself, a fight to save its own creation from its own fatal flaws. The destroyer had become the unwilling preserver, and the monument to power had become a monument to unintended consequences. The resolution, when it finally came, was as massive and expensive as the original project itself. In the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the state finally embarked on a multi-year, multi-hundred million dollar project to reclad the entire Empire State Plaza. Every single one of the original 28,000 marble panels was removed. They were replaced with new, stronger panels of Georgia marble, attached with a redesigned, more robust anchoring system. It was a monumental undertaking, a quiet admission of failure, and a desperate attempt to finally make Rockefeller's dreams safe. But the crisis had revealed a deeper truth. The plaza was more than just a collection of buildings, it was an idea. It was the idea that progress requires destruction. The idea that the vision of one powerful man can override the lives of thousands of ordinary people. The idea that you can build a perfect future by simply bulldozing the imperfect past. And the falling marble was a stark, terrifying reminder that sometimes the past refuses to be erased. Sometimes the cracks in the foundation, both literal and metaphorical, will eventually find their way to the surface. The government had tried and failed to destroy the Rockefeller mansion. Then, Rockefeller had used the government to successfully destroy a neighborhood, and in the end, the government was forced to spend a fortune to stop its own creation from destroying itself. It's a story of power, of hubris, of the complex and often contradictory relationship between the American people, their government, and the very landscape of their lives. So we come back to where we started. A cold night in March 1961, a fire, a governor fleeing in his nightclothes, and a question: why would the American government try to destroy a Rockefeller mansion? And the answer, we now see, is more complex and more fascinating than we could have imagined. The government wasn't a villain in a black hat, cackling as it swung a wrecking ball. It was something far more familiar and perhaps more dangerous. It was a bureaucracy. It was a committee of practical, sensible people who looked at a burned-out 105-year-old building and saw liability. They saw a fire trap. They saw an opportunity to tear down the old and build the new, to be more efficient, more modern, more cost-effective. They didn't see a home. They didn't see a symbol. They didn't see a priceless piece of American history that had housed 3 presidents. They saw a problem on a balance sheet. And the easiest way to solve that problem was with a bulldozer. The government tried to destroy the mansion not out of malice, but out of a cold, calculated pragmatism. A pragmatism that so often, in the name of progress, becomes the enemy of memory. And how did the mansion survive? What was its survival secret? The secret was that for a brief, critical moment, the mansion wasn't just another piece of state property, it was the home of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, a man who could have built himself 1,000 new homes, chose to fight for this old one. He fought for it not just because it was his house, but because he, more than anyone, understood the power of symbols. He knew that to tear down the executive mansion would be to tear down a piece of New York's soul. And he simply would not allow it. He poured his own money, his own passion, and his own immense political capital into the fight. He transformed a bureaucratic debate about budgets and building codes into a moral crusade for historic preservation. He saved the mansion because he made it personal, he made it his own. And in doing so, he gave it back to the people of New York, more beautiful and more secure than it had ever been. But this is where the story turns, where the hero of one story becomes the antagonist of another. The very same power that saved the mansion was then turned, with devastating force, on the city of Albany. The same man who fought to preserve one historic building used the government to obliterate an entire historic neighborhood. The same passion for building a better, more beautiful world led him to destroy the world of 7,000 people. This is the legacy of Nelson Rockefeller, written in the landscape of Albany. You can see it today. Drive down Eagle Street, and you will see the executive mansion standing proud and elegant, a testament to the power of preservation. It is a warm, inviting, human-scaled building. It feels like a home. It feels like a place where history lives. Then, turn the corner, and you are confronted with the Empire State Plaza. It is vast, it is monumental, it is breathtaking in its scale and ambition, but it is also cold, it is sterile. It is a place of government, not of people. It is a place that feels like it was dropped from another planet, a place that has no connection to the city it dominates. It is a monument to a man's vision, but it is also a tombstone for a lost neighborhood, One building saved, 1,000 buildings destroyed, one man's home preserved, 7,000 people's homes erased. This is the paradox of power. The same force that can create can also destroy. The same government that can be a guardian of our history can also be the instrument of its erasure. And the story of the Rockefeller Mansion and the Empire. State Plaza is the story of that paradox, played out in brick and marble in the life of one extraordinary man and the lives of thousands of ordinary people. In the end, the mansion that the government tried to destroy still stands. It stands because a Rockefeller decided it was worth saving. But just beyond its gates, the ghost of a neighborhood still lingers, a silent reminder that for every monument we build, there is a price to be paid. And that the real story of power is not just in what we choose to save, but also in what and who we are willing to destroy.